When a week ago today, Mr. Speaker, I asked the House to fix this afternoon as the occasion for a statement, I feared it would be my hard lot to announce the greatest military disaster in our long history. I thought, and some good judges agreed with me, that perhaps 20 or 30,000 men might be re-embarked. But it certainly seemed that the whole of the French First Army and the whole of the British Expeditionary Force north of the Amiens-Abbeville gap would be broken up in the open field, or else would have to capitulate for lack of food and ammunition. These were the hard and heavy tidings for which I called upon the House and the nation to prepare themselves a week ago. The whole root and core and brain of the British Army, on which ago today we were to build and are to build the great British armies in the later years of the war, seemed about to perish upon the field or be led into an ignominious and starving captivity. The enemy attacked us on all sides with great strength and fierceness, and their main power, the power of their far more numerous air force, was thrown into the battle or else concentrated upon Dunkirk and the beaches. Pressing in upon the narrow exit, both from the east and from the west, the enemy began to fire with cannon upon the beaches by which alone the shipping could approach or depart. They sowed magnetic mines in the channels and seas. They sent repeated waves of hostile aircraft, sometimes more than 100 strong in one formation, to cast their bombs upon the single pier that remained, and upon the sand dunes on which the troops had their only shelter. Their U-boats, one of which was sunk, and their motor launches took the toll of the vast traffic which now began. For 4 or 5 days an intense struggle reigned. All their armored divisions, or what was left of them, together with great masses of infantry and artillery, hurled themselves in vain upon the ever-narrowing, ever-contracting appendix within which the British and French armies fought. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy, with the willing help of countless merchant seamen, strained every nerve to embark the British and Allied troops. 220 light warships and 650 other vessels were engaged.
Welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us at our latest Future Tense Social. This is very exciting for me because I'm a huge fan of Erik Larson's books, and we all got to listen to a little bit of Churchill as we were warming up to get in the mood. My name is Andres Martinez. I'm the editorial director of Future Tense, which is a collaboration between New America, Slate Magazine, and Arizona State University. We look at the implications of the impact of technology on society. I'm also a professor of practice at our Cronkite School of Journalism out at Arizona State University. It's really an honor and pleasure to have you with us today, Erik. And what brings us here today is your latest book, The Splendid and the Vile, a saga of Churchill, family, and defiance during the Blitz. As all of you probably know, I'm sure, Erik is also the author of such fabulous books as Deadwake, In the Garden of Beasts, Thunderstruck, Devil in White City. I have read most of your books, but I have not read your first book. I was intrigued looking at your biography that you wrote a book called The Naked Consumer, How Companies Spy on Individual Consumers, which is actually a very future tensey subject. So maybe we will have you come back and talk about that one. I also loved on your website, which all of you listening should check out. I think it's eriklarsonbooks.com. I loved on your website, you have an alternative biography, which is fantastic. And you described The Naked Consumer as a book that you really liked, but nobody else did. and I seriously doubt that, but I'm gonna take a look at that. So welcome, and really thank you for thank you for being with us. I think we should just get right to it, and I want to, because we're having this conversation today of all days, I feel like I should ask the question that I'm sure is on everyone's minds, and that is, how did Winston Churchill celebrate Cinco de Mayo? No, I'm kidding. But
that would stump me. That would stump me.
That was okay. You're like, that was not one of the things we discussed. No, in all seriousness, we are having this event on Zoom as opposed to in person, which I would have loved, because we're on, lockdown, quarantine, house arrest. Choose your term in the face of this global pandemic. And so I just want to read a paragraph from your book just to set a scene here. You wrote, Churchill's notion of what constituted an office was expansive. Often generals, ministers, and staff members would find themselves meeting with Churchill while he was in his bathtub, one of his favorite places to work. He also liked working in bed and spent hours there each morning going through dispatches and reports with a typist seated nearby. Always present was the box, a black dispatch box that contained reports, correspondence, and minutes from other officials requiring his attention, replenished daily by his private secretaries. So clearly, Winston Churchill was someone who had mastered the art of working from home. That is something that we're all struggling to do these days. And so maybe not the place that these conversations about your book usually start, but I'm really curious as to whether you think Churchill would have some your mortals on working from home.
Let's put it this way. If I were Winston Churchill and I were doing the Zoom interview with you right now, I would be in the bathtub. I'd be in the bathtub. And actually, Churchill had no sense of vanity, and he very likely would have been completely naked doing it. But he was an ace work at homer. I mean, the guy would get up relatively late in the morning and he would work in bed. He had his typist, his personal secretary, nearby at all times with a typewriter taking notes. He would more than likely have a cigar, and also, frankly, more than likely would have and this is very appropriate for today, would very likely have a tumbler full of water and whiskey. Very little whiskey in it, but nonetheless a whiskey and water.
It's interesting you talk about. We tend to think of this, epic relationship, friendship, partnership, alliance, whatever we want to call it, between FDR and Churchill, and the communications going back and forth between Washington and London and the summits. But it was interesting reading your book how a lot of the early conversations in DC when Churchill first enters office is about the drinking and sort of some of his the sort of over the top nature of his personality, and sort of, I guess people were wondering, is this somebody we can take seriously?
Yeah. Well, drinking has always been something that people have noted about Churchill, but it is a mistake to ever think that he was a drunk or an alcoholic. He certainly was not. In fact, his very close private secretary, John Colville, wrote later on that he had never seen Churchill drunk or even in any way with his faculties limited by alcohol. And Churchill himself once said to Clementine, by the way, he once said to her, after she was criticizing him for drinking, he said, I've taken a lot more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me, so that's how he felt. One thing, back to the working at home aspect, one thing that certainly resonates today is that Churchill in this period spent a lot of time at the prime ministerial country home Chequers every weekend, and actually later began dividing his time between two country homes, which is what a lot of people are also doing now. So he would have been very likely quite at home with this whole situation.
And I was struck that I did not know this. Chequers was donated by somebody to the government. Was that correct? As a kind of as a Camp David. I mean, it was more of a traditional country home, I suppose.
Well, it was an American who donated. Arthur Lee, before the war, well before the war, back in I believe he donated it in 1940. Anyway, don't quote me on that one. But anyways, yeah, it was donated to the government. The idea being that Chequers was to be used. No work was to be done there. This is according
That's
to
what I was
Arthur
going to
Lee's
bring up.
original. No work was to be done there. It was a place so that prime ministers could sort of just enjoy the bucolic countryside and let their faculties restore. Now, Churchill, of course, took that very, very differently. He decided to make this his country command post and
Right.
packed it every weekend with guests and booze and fun.
So I have to confess that when I first heard that this was the subject of your next book, I was intrigued. I feel like I had read quite a lot about this first year of Churchill's being in office and that moment, you know, the finest hour that Britain faced and the Blitz and so forth. And I think if this, you know, recently I read, I think it was Andrew Roberts's biography of Churchill and you know, I feel like a lot of us are, even if we're not specialists, we have been inundated with books about this great historical character. And I might have skipped this book had it not been written by you, but I having read your other books, I felt like he is going to have a new angle, a new insight, some new framing. But was it daunting at all? I mean, did you write about Churchill because you felt like there were too many books written about Abraham Lincoln, or what was it that drew you to this subject?
No, listen, I was totally daunted. But let me be clear. It was not actually Churchill that drew me to do this book. Churchill kind of entered the party a little bit late in the process, because what had happened is that I had decided, for a variety of relatively complicated reasons, that it would be very interesting to look into how it was that people actually got through the day during the Blitz, during the German air campaign, and including that portion we know as the Blitz. How did they actually do it? And the reason was, I mean, the reason was that my wife and I had moved from Seattle to New York City. And no sooner did I move to New York City than I had this kind of epiphany about what 9/11 had been like for New Yorkers versus what the rest of us who perhaps watched it in real time had experienced. And it's just a world of difference. This, you know, not just the sense and sights, but also the sense of violation of having your home city attacked.
Right.
And that's what made me start thinking about writing about how people actually got through the Blitz. I mean, as you can imagine, 57 consecutive nights of bombing. How did people get through it? My original thought was maybe I'll just write about the typical London family. So I thought about that. Then I thought, wait a minute, why not the quintessential London family? Churchill, his family, his advisors, and see exactly how they got through the day. And really, much to my surprise, well, nobody had actually done that. Nobody had decided to take
Right.
a close look at that day-to-day experience. And that's what really helped me get through it. But was I daunted? Oh, yes. Once I realized how much material had been written about Churchill and how much good stuff also. I mean, people like Andrew Roberts, he's my favorite of the Churchill scholars, actually. He's a brilliant writer. So much material had been done that I actually early on had to make a strategic decision about how I was going to pursue the research. The idea of reading everything that had ever been written about Churchill or by Churchill, which itself would have been a Herculean task, I realized would be a fool's errand. It would take me a decade. And even then, by the time I got to the 10th year, I wouldn't be done because 8 more books would come out about Churchill. So what I did, I made a strategic decision that I was going to simply read as much as I could to get a sense of Churchill and the landscape in that period, and then dive right into the archives to see what was really there. That's where I feel most comfortable with original materials and so forth. And so that's how I managed to kind of pare things down. Otherwise, I would have just been overwhelmed. That's not to say, however, that every single day for the last 4.5 years that I did not, in fact, ask myself, what am I doing?
Well, it was very interesting to see the how I mean, it did feel like a portrait of Churchill's orbit, and you had we were often seeing Churchill and that historical moment through the eyes of his personal secretary or his daughter or other advisors that sometimes are not quite. We don't necessarily see things through their perspective as much, and some of the other accounts that I have read. You mentioned Churchill's own writing. One of the things that astonished me reading the Roberts biography was I never had realized just how prolific. I mean, I was familiar with the histories he wrote after the war, but the fact that throughout his life he would always get himself out of financial holes by his own writing, and he was so prolific and commanded quite a lot of money for his journalistic writings earlier. In a way that I had not fully appreciated.
And ultimately, it was his writing that got him ultimately, finally, out of the financial hole. But this is one of the things about Churchill that is so remarkable is that he was extremely well read. He was an extremely talented writer, and also quite good painter. But he all this went into that machine that was, Churchill's brain, and it all really helped him in this process of trying to lead the nation through the crisis of that German air campaign.
So it's interesting that you said you gravitated towards this moment by thinking about what it must have been like to be in New York on 9/11, and then sort of multiply that by 57 nights of the Blitz and so forth. And then your book comes out in early 2020, and of course, we are now the entire world is fighting off this global pandemic, which is an existential challenge to our societies that's quite different from war, although we see people reaching for those analogies. But the analogy that is unquestionable is the need for leadership to mobilize society to meet the crisis at hand that requires extraordinary efforts and sacrifices. And so I want to ask you about that and whether there's a secret sauce to Churchill's leadership. But before we even get to that, and you've started alluding to this, but maybe just sort of set the scene. May 10th, 1940, amazing day in history. It's where your account starts. It's 80 years from this coming Sunday. I was also thinking about that in preparation of this. So just sort of set the scene in terms of describing what it was that the UK and Winston Churchill were facing.
Yeah, so May 10th, 1940, which is when the action starts in my book, was the day that Churchill became prime minister, the greatest day in his life. I think even he would agree. This is the thing that he wanted most of all. He became prime minister owing to a rebellion in the House of Commons, where the consensus was that Neville Chamberlain, the prior prime minister, was not up to the challenge of dealing with Hitler and Germany. But that same day, May 10, 1940, was the day that Hitler went, the so-called phony war ceased to be a phony war. It became a hot shooting war when Hitler invaded the Low Countries. So here's this situation where Churchill, this is the greatest day of his life, but also one of the darkest days in the history of the world. This did not daunt Churchill. Churchill thought this is like added spice to the challenge. The idea of being in charge of this great empire at such a dire time really kind of thrilled him. But he becomes prime minister. He immediately appoints his cabinet, and this is sort of a crucial element also. We can talk about the people he appointed, two of them in particular, who are main characters in this book, who in I think in other works have been relegated to simply the secondary posture. But he quickly appoints his cabinet, but he immediately is confronting, we talk about existential threats. The presumption at the time was that once Germany consolidated its hold over France, the British Expeditionary Force was being expelled. That's what that speech was about the chaos at Dunkirk and so forth. That once France fell, and it would seem quite certain that France was going to fall, that the entire strategic picture would change. Prior to France falling, the assumption was that France would always stand, that this would keep the Luftwaffe at bay, because the planes would not be, well, the fighter escorts in particular, would not have the endurance to fly all the way to Britain. Suddenly, with France falling, there were German air bases on the coast of the English Channel, literally just minutes away from England and minutes away from London, something that planners in Britain had never even speculated on. So you have suddenly you had that threat and the very real fear that Hitler, that Germany was going to invade in a cross-channel attack. This seemed to many people, most people at that time, to be a certainty that if Germany ever attained air superiority over the channel, there was going to be an invasion. So if you can imagine taking control of Britain, taking at this time when not only has Hitler, begun invading various countries in Europe and succeeding and just crushing them, but now suddenly he's facing what could be an existential threat in terms of an invasion across the channel. I mean, what a hellish prospect for any normal mortal, but not actually for Churchill. He took this on with a verve and a gusto that came through time and time again in subsequent months.
And we were listening to snippets of his speech and his oratory. We've all been exposed to it, and there've been lots of Hollywood renditions, and and obviously he had a gift with the language. But when you think of his recipe for leadership, I think there's a tendency to just focus on the oratory and that ability to communicate and inspire through, sort of leveraging the English language maybe shouldn't be underestimated. But was it mostly that he was a great communicator, or how much of the ratio of elements and in his success was that?
Yeah, well, it was excuse me, it was a mix of things. First of all, we're all familiar with the oratory, the great lines. There never has so much been owed by so many to so few. But I would argue that that's not really the strong point of his speeches. In fact, at the time, that particular line did not necessarily have the same resonance it does now for all of us. It was basically a speech. It was just a speech. But the thing that made Churchill, I think, particularly excellent at communicating not just news and information, but also communicating also a sense of reason for courage, is how he structured his speeches. And we got a taste of that at the opening speech about Dunkirk. First of all, he was a great storyteller, and he was telling, as you heard in those opening moments, he was telling it as a story. As this is what was happening. This is how it was unfolding. Sort of a thrilling story if you think about it. But what he would do is he would give his audience a sober appraisal of the situation, not happy talk, just a really down-to-earth, sober appraisal. Sometimes too sober and too detailed, and it scared the heck out of his audience on occasion. But then he would follow with comments about real grounds for why people should be optimistic by how this problem of the Blitz, of Dunkirk, of the potential for a German invasion, how this can be resolved. Positive reason for optimism. And again, not happy talk, real grounds for optimism. And then would come this rhetorical flourish at the end that would metaphorically, and perhaps not so metaphorically, have people rising from their seats and saying, all right, I'm going to be part of this. We're going to take this guy on, God damn it. And this is how this is going to be. We're going to beat Hitler. That was a very powerful thing. But there's another element to Churchill's leadership, a couple of other elements. One is, and this comes into play also in terms of his ability to communicate, he being this great reader of history, he had this ability to place people into the grand epic of British history, to make them feel as if they were part of this great island story, as he would put it. And that's very important, to make them all feel part of this thing, this great tradition that they had to unfold. But also, he had a real understanding of the power of symbolic acts along a continuum, even something as simple as refusing to call Hitler by his name. He would say that man or that wicked man, which when you think about it, it's a very subtle, very tiny thing, but it's a very powerful thing. If you don't identify, if you don't demonize your enemy, it makes him seem a little like this unimportant presence off in the distance. But then at the other end of this continuum, He learned very early on in the Blitz the power of visiting bombed out areas and showing himself there, showing himself, sternly, surveying the damage, talking to people, expressing emotion. He was not afraid at all of weeping in public, but also showing his resolve simply by being there. He was engaging in a courageous act and was showing defiance. And this was a very, very powerful thing. Just to give you a sort of a contemporary example, I mean, I had to laugh in a sort of a grim way the other day when we saw Vice President Mike Pence at the Mayo Clinic without a mask when everybody else around him was wearing a mask. And to think of that, to think of the optics of that, possibly appealing to one tiny slice of America, maybe, but somebody like Churchill would be wearing that mask. He'd be charging around, saying this is what we do. That's that power of symbolic acts. And if you engage in symbolic acts that create a dissonance with your audience, like you don't wear a mask when your audience knows damn well you should be wearing that mask, that's a problem. That's a problem. That undercuts your credibility as a leader. So Churchill had this acute sense of the power of symbolic acts. Another example of that, by the way, is that he certainly seemed to be utterly fearless, and frankly, I think fearlessness is infectious, and as I would argue, can be taught, sort of the art of fearlessness. But when there were air raids, Churchill was more than likely to go up on the nearest roof to watch that air raid and to bring people with him, including staff. So that's the kind of leader he was.
Yeah, I've actually been to the bunker, which they've now expanded to a nice museum in London.
Yeah.
That was there for him, and of course to read that he wasn't going to be very excited to spend that much time there because he was going to the rooftops and stuff.
Yeah, he only spent 3 nights actually in the Churchill war rooms.
In the war rooms, yeah. One of the things that fascinates me, and I don't, maybe you could talk a little bit about this as a source, is the extent to which we have some real-time information on how people responded to his speeches and so forth through this project of mass observation. It's something I first learned about reading Britain's War by Daniel Todman, a book about the home front and describing this mass observation phenomenon, or I guess it was a sociological project. But
yeah.
Can you just describe that a little bit? I don't know what today's equivalent of that would be. I mean, maybe it'd be social media or people's Google searches, but talk a little bit about that, because that's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, so Mass Observation was a social sciences organization that was founded before the war. The point being to create, as its founder said, to create a social psychology of ourselves. The idea being to recruit hundreds of diarists to just write about daily life in Britain, just the quotidian things. In fact, one way that the diarists recruited to do this were to kind of sharpen their skills was to describe things on their mantelpiece. It's that kind of daily personal detail that was supposed to go into these diaries. Well, so here are all these diarists, keeping their diaries, submitting them to Mass Observation for analysis. And then the war starts, and many of these diarists continue to keep their diaries. What a tremendous resource. One of my favorite diarists of this Mass Observation group, young woman, Olivia Cockett, who is, she is a clerk for Scotland Yard. She is dating an older man. Well, he's a married man. She's in this love affair with an older man. And her diary shows this, I think, shows in metaphorically what the broader culture, in Britain was experiencing and how they evolved. Here comes the Blitz, September 7, 1940. She is terrified, like everybody else in London. This is a shocking thing. Up until then, the belief was that for whatever reason, London was not going to be attacked, by German bombers directly. She's terrified. Over time, she becomes less terrified. The pivotal moment for her is when an incendiary bomb lands outside her house. When the Germans attacked at night, they would first, simultaneously in many cases, but they would first drop a lot of incendiary bombs. The point being to set things on fire so that the flames would serve as a beacon for bombers to follow, because this is still an era when flying at night was best done with moonlight. And if you didn't have moonlight, you had to have these fires
Right.
as beacons. So one of these incendiary bombs landed outside her house. She put out the incendiary bomb. She snuffed this thing out, and she was so proud of herself, so elated, that really suddenly she was no longer afraid. She had stood up to this awful assault from Germany, and she had had the courage to do this and had the courage to put this thing out. Meanwhile, her lover became, as she's quite candid about her lover and about their sex life, actually. Meanwhile, her lover became more and more fearful. And my favorite moment is as the story proceeds, as time passes, they're walking as an air raid begins to occur, and they hear two bombs falling. They have a distinctive sound. They hear two bombs falling, and her lover shouts for her to get down, and she says, "Not in my new coat, I'm not."
That's great. That's great. So, we are, as I mentioned, future tense. We're usually focused on our relationship to technology and the impact of technology on society. And so part of the reason I wanted to have this conversation with you, other than the fact that I'm a fan of your books and a history buff, there is sort of a future tense connection here, which is one of the other things that I was really struck by reading your book, however familiar I may or may not have been with Churchill, is that you really portray him as I don't know if you would call him a technologist in today's sense of the word, but certainly like a tech enthusiast. And the character Professor Lindemann in the book is an interesting one, and his role as part of Churchill's circle. So, if you could just talk a little bit about that relationship and Churchill's relationship to science and technology writ large.
Sure.
I mean, clearly, that whether it was radar or all the cryptography that we're familiar with the Enigma code, and technology was a huge part of what turned the tide and helped the Allies, and in particular the English contributions. But that was not something, we have this image of Churchill as sort of like this antiquated figure from the distant past. And I think even in his day, a lot of people had that image of Churchill. So he's not necessarily like technology savvy, isn't necessarily the first thing that comes to mind. But in your book, that was kind of an interesting theme.
Yeah. Well, first of all, he loved the idea of secret weapons. He was a big believer in the potential for technology to give Britain a significant edge in terms of weaponry and so forth. Toward that end, one of the advisors he appointed, and this is another aspect of his leadership smarts, by the way, his special sauce, if you will, was that he appointed advisors that he knew would give him the straight story. He didn't appoint people who were simply going to suck up to him and say, oh yes, my lord, you are doing exactly the right thing. Frederick Lindemann was one of the most thoroughly disliked men in the government, in Whitehall, in the district of London that is considered to be the British government. He was disliked by just about everybody, except maybe Churchill, and except maybe Churchill's wife and the Churchill's children, because Frederick Lindemann, aka the Prof, never forgot their birthdays. But he was shortly after Churchill became prime minister, he appointed Frederick Lindemann, the Prof, to be his personal scientific advisor, which was a very, very smart, very savvy move. Because first of all, it gave Churchill an insight into what technological things were actually happening within Britain, within the defense establishment. But also it gave Frederick Lindemann carte blanche to investigate anything that he wanted to, any technological issue. And this was very powerful because it assured that Churchill was going to be getting the straight story. He's going to be getting the straight story, not something that was fabricated, not something that was massaged, because Frederick Lindemann had this ability to look into anybody's affairs, any ministry's affairs, and bring back a report to Churchill. And in some cases, he actually wrote his own his own memoranda for Churchill to sign that would be distributed then to the ministries in question. And this proved to be a very, very valuable thing. For example, it turned out that the British didn't really actually know how many planes, no surprise there, but didn't really know how many aircraft Germany had, and it's kind of an important thing to know in terms of what kind of offensive they could wage, but also didn't know how many aircraft the RAF had. That was another issue, and that comes out in the saga as well. In fact, it was such a conundrum that Churchill decided he would have to actually hire a criminal court judge to review the evidence on both sides. This was the judge who had actually handled a very famous murder case called the Jigsaw Murder, because the bodies were chopped up into so many pieces that they had to be reassembled before they could sort of make a determination of cause of death, and not cause of death, but who the victims were and so forth. But anyway, so he actually had to hire a judge to sit in on this meeting of the minds about just statistical assessments, reconnaissance, all these other technological elements, codes, and so forth, to try to determine how many planes did these people have, and how many planes do we have. So it was a fascinating thing. But the prof is one of those characters who gets short shrift, I feel, in Churchillian histories, and he was crucial to the story.
And there's also I'm sorry, I'm thinking about what you said about Churchill's not needing to surround himself with yes men who are going to tell him. And I don't know if it's there's also been sort of a cultural shift, but in our contemporary politics, it seems like you cannot have any press conference or cabinet meeting without everybody going around and thanking the leader for his tremendous, and I think in the Trump administration has taken that to a completely new level. But I think there's it's broader than that. It's more widespread. But I don't get the sense that was when there were updates about the situation on the front lines, that they spent 20-30 minutes thanking Churchill for his great leadership.
But there's an analogy that we can make actually to the contemporary situation, is that I would argue that that Anthony Fauci serves the purpose today of Frederick Lindemann, of the prof. The difference being that the current administration doesn't want that kind of input, doesn't like having somebody like Fauci out there as sort of a loose cannon, whereas Churchill wanted Frederick Lindemann to be in everybody's face. This was his mandate, was to get out there and cause trouble, and he did in spades.
And I want to remind people that you can upload questions on the Q&A feature, and we're starting to get some, but don't forget about that. And then on the sort of industrial side, Eric, you had Lord Beaverbrook, who was sort of the production czar, and he's an interesting character too that I feel might be a little bit more familiar. But and we had analogous characters once the U.S. entered the war. Forget his name, but a former CEO of GM was brought in for $1 a year, famously by FDR, to sort of ramp up production. And Beaverbrook, I guess, even if they didn't know they had how many planes they had, the RAF realized they needed a lot more, and so he's brought in for that. And that was another interesting relationship.
Well, yeah. So Lord Beaverbrook is another key element of the story. I mean, Beaverbrook has obviously there have been biographies of him, but again, I feel that in larger biographies of Churchill, he tends to get sort of still somewhat short shrift. But he was crucial in this era. And the wonderful thing about well, first of all, he was widely hated as well. And in that case, even Clementine Churchill did not like Lord Beaverbrook. But immediately after Churchill became prime minister, he appointed Beaverbrook the Minister of Aircraft Production, and set up an entirely new ministry, the Ministry of Aircraft Production, because Churchill recognized something early on, and that is Churchill and his military advisors recognized something early on, and that is that if Britain was ever to be able to repel an invasion, it would require first it would require that they hold the Luftwaffe at bay. If the Luftwaffe got air superiority, the potential for an invasion would be very, very big indeed. So, and he realized also, though, that the only way to prevent Germany from getting air superiority is through the use of fighter aircraft to take down their fighters and take down their bombers. So he appoints Beaverbrook to be a minister of aircraft production with the express goal of ramping up production of fighters. Fighter production was already starting to increase, but on a very sort of programmed level. Churchill recognized much more had to be done. Britain needed vast numbers of fighters to repel this assault. Beaverbrook steps in. He'd never built an industrial object before. He was a newspaper baron. His smarts were in with newspapers and ramping up circulation and knowing the dirt on everybody else. So now suddenly he's put in charge of this Ministry of Aircraft Production. And the whole point was to shake things up. Churchill knew that this guy was hated. Churchill also knew that he was incredibly energetic and incredibly smart, and that if anybody could do this job, it was going to be Lord Beaverbrook. And he did. He came through to an incredible degree, maybe not as incredible as he would like people to remember, but to an incredible degree, and really kind of saved the day. So there too, yeah, it's not exactly the technology side, but he really understood not the manufacturing of aircraft, but he understood the motivation of people. And one of the most interesting things that that he did was he made sure that RAF pilots, actual pilots, people who actually had their wings, would visit aircraft industry, aircraft manufacturing companies to talk about what the planes were doing and how valuable it was that they were doing it. Another thing, here too, he was sort of very good at the power of symbolic of gestures as well. They would bring German aircraft, if they were shot down, they would put them on the back of a truck and drive them through towns, as if they're just simply reclaiming this aircraft and bringing it back. But the point was to show people, we've done this. We've brought down this German aircraft, which is another sort of clever little detail.
One of the things that it's also easy to forget is the longevity that Churchill had on the historical scene. I mean, he doesn't become prime minister until 1940, May 10th, as you say. And by that point, he's how old?
When he becomes prime minister, 65.
Okay, 65. But he had been this, famous character even in his youth because of his experiences in the Boer Wars and his writings about it. And then he is in a high position in the cabinet during World War I, with some controversies involving Gallipoli. But there is a question.
Well, he gets kicked out of his post as First Lord of the Admiralty because of Gallipoli.
Right. I was putting it nicely, but you're right. So Amy Jackson has a question. She's in the audience and she's asking an interesting question about, so I bring up the longevity because of course, Churchill was the First Lord of the Admiralty during the time frame, I think, of the sinking of the Lusitania. And so he is a character in Dead Wake, your book about the Lusitania, which was also amazing. I highly recommend it. And so Amy's question was, did your research for this book change the image of Churchill that you had then and that you portrayed in Dead Wake? And I was wondering if that's one of the things that led you to want to write more about this character.
Well, so the answer to your question is no. The answer to her question, that's a very interesting question. I in writing about Churchill in the book about the Lusitania, I liked Churchill even then. I mean, I know he screwed up with Gallipoli, and that's really an interesting story in and of itself. But I think rather than changing my perception of him, it's sort of it fleshed out my sense of what Churchill was really all about, and made him seem to me a richer. His experience during World War I informed my research in this current book by making him seem more of a nuanced character, a flawed character, which he was. He was deeply flawed, and make no mistake that that you can criticize Churchill for many, many things, especially in his post World War II roles, and also in some of the things he did prior to. He basically was an arch imperialist.
Yeah.
But during this period, he was in fact the leader of the moment, the man of the hour, and his experience during World War I was I think important to know, because he screwed up. He screwed up big time in that prior experience, and now here he was coming into this role during this even well, not, I think actually one could argue it's a graver apparent existential threat. How he then, how he mustered the confidence to do so, I mean, was a tremendous story. But the first did not lead me to do this at all. So.
Right, gotcha. You talk about him being a flawed character, and him being sort of an arch imperialist, and I always get the sense, and this really comes across in the Roberts biography too, that even in his days, he seemed somewhat, his way of thinking seemed a little bit outdated and overly nostalgic, and and in the 30s I think he's seen by many people as a bit preposterous and over the top and too melodramatic, and partly it's because he's beating the drums on the threat that the Nazis pose, and other people wanted to have a more temperate. But I do wonder if when you think about the kind of leadership that we need when a democratic society is facing an existential crisis, is the persona and the traits that you need in a leader, maybe they're different from the kinds of leaders and traits in your leaders that you want in a time of normalcy. I mean, that May 10th, 1940, they turned to Churchill, who was sort of, this larger than life and character that was sort of had been so out of the mainstream until sort of events caught up. It's like they have no more choice in a way. And then one of the things that's just so poignant about the whole saga of the war from the British perspective and the Churchill protagonist is that he gets voted out of office, right. 2 months after VE Day, a month before the war ends in Japan. I mean, that's just, it's so unimaginable to us reading and to us learning about this and, 80 years on, that would happen to somebody who sort of carried the country through this experience on his shoulders. And so was there a realization even then that this guy's great for an emergency, but this is not the kind of, there's too much melodrama in this type of leadership for peacetime?
I don't know about the melodrama part, but clearly what brought Churchill in was a profound sense that Neville Chamberlain was not up to the task, and clearly the British public at the end of the war, just before the end of the war, had the same but contrapuntal feeling about Churchill, that while he was great, during the war, confident, strong, and really able to rouse the public with his rhetoric, maybe that's not what we need now. Maybe now we need a little bit more stability, a little bit, to manage the post-war era. So yeah, I mean, I think that there are people who are suited to certain kinds of leadership, just as there are certain generals who are suited for desk jobs, and there are certain generals who are suited for being out there on the battlefield. And so, yeah.
Right. There are a couple of questions here about Coventry, which are interesting. It's something that you hear off and on about, and I'm not clear exactly on what's urban legend and what's truth. Tom Herman asks, Eric, a movie indicated that Churchill was told by the decoders at Bletchley about an impending attack by Germany, and that Churchill chose not to warn the target, I think it was Coventry, he says, because that would make the Germans realize their codes had been cracked. Any truth to that story?
Not in the case of Coventry. Nothing that I found. The story of Coventry is this, because thanks to code breaking and deciphering German Luftwaffe communications, it was known that there was a big raid that was coming. It was called Moonlight Sonata. Was the code name, but it wasn't at all clear where this thing was going to go. The presumption was among air intelligence was in British air intelligence. The presumption was that the attack was going to be on London, and I thought it was going to be on a particular night. It actually happened one night earlier. Churchill a report was done full of detail, and that was meant for the prime minister. It was given to him, apparently, according to one account, given to him in the car as he was leaving town to go to Chequers. And it was so alarming, suggesting that there was this massive raid that was going to occur against London that night. He came back, and in fact, he was on the rooftop of one of the, I think it was the Air Ministry building. He was on the rooftop waiting for this huge raid that he feared would come, but it was not coming to London. It was coming to Coventry. So did he know this raid was going to come? He did know a raid was coming. He didn't know, and he presumed that the target was going to be London. He had no idea that Coventry was going to be involved.
And also on the subject of Coventry, which you described the aftermath very movingly. David Peters thanks you for joining us, and he says he found your description of that aftermath of the bombing of Coventry apropos to our current moment, particularly the speech by the bishop at the first mass funeral, where he says, "Let us vow before God to be better friends and neighbors in the future, because we have suffered this together and have stood here today." From writing this book and your many others, what morals, beliefs, principles have you found have been critical in times of despair and tragedy? I guess what would be the modern day equivalent of that bishop's speech, asks David.
The modern day equivalent of that bishop's speech, even that we've heard thus far, well, nothing, frankly, from the federal government, but I think that New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo, one thing I've been impressed by in his daily briefings is his emphasis on yes, things are improving now, rates of hospitalization and so forth are coming down in New York State, but he's always very, very careful to emphasize how tragic, how the disaster of all these deaths night after night after night. He never has let us all forget the fact that what even though we're in this this race now to reduce the virus to make it subside, he's always reminding us of the grave losses that we are still experiencing. He never loses that perspective, and that's a very important thing. Another aspect of leadership, and Churchill had this as well, is first of all, I think to be an effective leader, I think you have to have a strong, well-balanced moral compass. And one ancillary effect of having a strong moral compass is that you also are able to experience and express empathy. And that's something that Churchill was very, very good about. He could manage both. He could manage waging war, which he loved. He was the first to confess that he loved the thrill of war, but he was also deeply empathic and understood on a very personal level what the people of Britain were experiencing. That speech by the bishop at Coventry was, to me, I think, very, 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 very moving and very, very Christian in the best sense. I found it very important to make reference to that.
So we're saying a lot of nice things about Churchill in terms of his rising to the occasion in that first year and meeting the moment. But Janice asks a question. She writes in that the book gives very little attention to any unhappiness in the population with Churchill and his handling of the war. Was there indeed very little of this?
Well, I can't go through all the home intelligence reports now and tell you what I found and didn't find, but the overall sense that I got was that people were quite satisfied with Churchill. But there were moments when they were less satisfied. It depends on which moments you want to talk about. But generally, the overall sense that I got about about the public and Churchill from home intelligence reports and from these mass observation diaries was that people were very impressed with him, and they were very, very satisfied and happy with his leadership. There are of course critics, but that
Well,
seemed to be the override sense.
yes, and certainly in a time of war, when you're facing an existential threat, there's a rally around the flag effect. You mentioned, and obviously over time, it people adjusted, and as we talked about, 4 years later, voted him out of office. But you were talking about 9/11. I think we can forget that 2 months after 9/11, in November of 2001, George W. Bush's approval ratings stood at 91% here in the U.S. And so that kind of effect is, and obviously in a global pandemic with all of the
Yeah.
current environment, it's not necessarily going to play out the same way.
No, it is also the case, though. One important thing to note also about Churchill is that one of the reasons he became prime minister in the first place was because he had overwhelming public support. And this is something that the king and the rebels actually had to acknowledge. The parliamentarian rebels had to acknowledge that he had this great reservoir of popularity, and it persisted through this, at least through this period.
A couple of people, I didn't want to get to this because a couple of people watching, and this was my reaction too, felt like Mary Churchill's diary was an amazing addition to your book. Somebody's asking, can you talk a little bit about the diary? Has this been used before in other books?
Yes. So first of all, Mary Churchill is my favorite character. The diary, I think, was a tremendous asset in working on this book. When I got permission to use it from her daughter, I was at that point one of only 2 people who had actually looked at this diary. So this diary is really very new in terms of new material and her perspective. The thing I loved about this diary was that, first of all, she's a very, very smart, very, very astute and accurate observer of everything around her. She adored her father and would grieve for him.
17 at the time.
17 right? At the time. She would grieve for him when he came under criticism, which he did periodically for perceived errors. But she was a wonderful observer and all that. But the thing that I really, really loved about Mary was that she was exactly the kind of presence or observer that I was trying to corral for this book, for this lens that I was trying to open on that particular period. So how they got through this thing, how did they do this on a daily basis? Because in addition to being a very, very astute observer and very smart and very articulate, observer, she also was, after all, a 17-year-old girl who really liked to have fun. Yeah. And there are references to snogging in the hayloft with young RAF pilots, going to parties at RAF bases. I mean, this was a lovely counterpoint, and also talking about her. She and a friend of hers at one point resolved that they were going to learn all the Shakespearean sonnets, one per day during that summer. They did okay at that, but I don't think they completed the mission. But anyway, so Mary Churchill turned out to be this really wonderful, charming character. I think she makes the book, honestly.
Yeah. So lastly, we have a question from Victoria, who talks about how she's struck by Churchill's appreciation and understanding of history, something that maybe he did share with the previously referenced Abraham Lincoln. And so you could say a little bit about that, but also her question is, what are you, as somebody who appreciates history, choosing to read these days while you are homebound in New York?
Well, I will tell you that when it comes to reading for pleasure, or in this particular time, I read totally for escape. I mean, I'm doing the literary equivalent of cowering. I mean, like, I love thrillers. Although I have to qualify that a little bit. I just finished reading William Golding's The Lord of the Flies. I'd read it before, but I reread it for whatever godforsaken reason. But it actually turned out to be a really great comforting kind of read for this period because, you know, honestly, I'd rather be sequestered in my house now under the circumstance I am than to be on that island with a bunch of primal schoolboys hell bent on killing each other. So anyway, it actually turned out to be kind of a very interesting read. But I read for distraction. I read I mean, I love a good thriller. You know, one of my favorite things that I just read recently was The Couple Next Door by Shari Lapina. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Terrific, nice, really, really sharp, kind of edgy thriller. So I read totally for escape. That's my mission right now.
Great. Well, Eric, this has been such a pleasure. The hour flew by. You know, on a personal note, I also I wanted to mention that you know, I've read a lot of your other books, as I'm sure a lot of us watching have, and in the Garden of Beasts was really, I had sort of a slight personal connection to it because my father, I grew up in Mexico, and my father, I'm a mutt. My mom was American. My father was Mexican. When my father was going to night school in Mexico City in the 50s, he was offered an like administrative office job by somebody named Alfred Stern, and got to know Martha Dodd. And when I was a kid, I would hear these interesting stories about these people that, I mean, he was like he was studying law at night and working during the day for this character who turns out was of great interest to the U.S. government. And to read your book where Martha Dodd is the daughter of the U.S. ambassador in Berlin 20 years before that, and quite the character, it was an interesting corroboration and
interesting
and postscript on these stories I would hear from my father. So
interesting.
So I thank you for that, and maybe at some point we could have a sidebar on that. But thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for
thank you
for watching this latest Future Tense social. We do these Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4 o'clock Eastern. Please check out the events page in New America or Slate, and come join us for more of these. And Eric, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stay safe, everybody. Thank you.